Hi everyone, welcome to Spill the Beans Digital Health Podcast. I hope you're well. My name is Duncan Goldie. My guest this week is Natalie Pankova. Natalie is the COO of Metadvice, which is a very interesting business. It's sort of using AI and machine learning to assist clinicians with diagnosis of a range of different illnesses and ailments. She goes into a lot more detail about it, so I'll leave it to her to explain it. But Natalie is a really interesting professional. She's come over from Canada. She's been here for a while, but she's got some great experience within digital health and biotechnology and pharma. She's still affiliated with the World Health Organization. There's a number of other organizations and startups and industries and things like that as well. So I don't know how she's managed to find the time to chat with me, but she did. So we're very grateful for that, and I'll let you take it away. Natalie, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me this morning. How's everything going? Whereabouts in the world are you right now?
Yeah, thanks very much, Duncan. It's my pleasure. I am currently in London in the UK, observing lockdown here and focusing on running Metadvice, which is more or less what I've been involved with for the majority of the last year and a half or so. Perfect. And I mean, how's the working from home situation for you? Do you have a good setup, or are you crammed away in a corner somewhere like the rest of us? It's not too bad. I am kind of cramped. I mean, if you know central London, there's not ever that much space, but it's not been too bad. We at Metadvice, we have always been relatively remote. So we've got kind of operations in Switzerland, we've got operations in the UK, and we've got some business partnerships in the US, though not full operations yet. So we interface with North America quite a lot. So we've been kind of remote from the beginning, or remote first, if you will. So it wasn't as bad as maybe some of the other companies that were always based in offices for us to move online. There's been, some challenges in just making sure that everyone's engaged and really having to ensure that we've got things that are set up that are more regular calls, regular check-ins, and so on. But for the most part, it's been quite good. We operate over Zoom most of the time, and we have been doing that even before the lockdown. And we've recently had our team day or team call over Zoom, which went pretty well.
Was that like a team building exercise, or?
Yeah, we had
kind of. What did you do?
We had some team building exercises. We were talking about the company vision and values, and I ran things over Slido and surveys over Zoom. So it was actually pretty good in the end. So it can be done if you plan for it. Yeah.
I think a lot of people are kind of realizing that now, that it's definitely going to reshape the new normal. I think after we come out of this, which everyone keeps on saying becomes a bit of a cheesy phrase now, but there's definitely some truth in the fact that you don't always have to be in the office with people. A lot of the time, it's nicer to be in the office with people, but it's not completely necessary in order to still be productive and to still have these kind of team building exercises and stuff like that as well. So
yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think and for startups, I think they'll realize that they don't have to invest in an office maybe right away, and they can wait to do that until that really becomes a necessity to some extent. So we'll see. I think there's definitely a lot of changes coming.
Yeah, definitely. And there has been for a while, so it's good to see as well. So, I mean, obviously your accent, it's not the sort of central London accent. You haven't quite got that Cockney twang. So in terms of your background, I mean, you've been in the digital health and prior to that, the kind of biotech and pharma industry for a long time. I mean, can you kind of talk us through a brief kind of history as to how you came up to where you are now?
Sure. So I'm originally from Canada, not the US. And I went to school, studied, and worked in Toronto for a number of years. So I did my PhD there, specialized as a medical researcher focused in ophthalmology and the inflammatory diseases of the eye. And that kind of brought me into the precision medicine space. So as we were looking at mechanisms and treatments for blinding eye disease, I started understanding more about complex disease, which really have different phenotypes, different patient subtypes, and those patients have different ways of responding to treatment. And I was kind of very fascinated about that. Some of that is based on genetics, some of that is based on the environment for the individual, but there are many different factors that are involved in how somebody is diagnosed and treated. And that brought me also into the artificial intelligence space, machine learning, AI, to be able to better stratify patients. So I started with some technology where we were imaging the back of the eye of patients and looking to stratify those images using machine learning technologies. I thought that was really fascinating, basically what technology can actually do. I thought that was a little bit more interesting than the standard pharma drug development approaches. And that kind of brought me into the digital aspects of health, which is what I've been focused on for the last few years. So moving into advanced technology like blockchain also, as well as AI within healthcare, but also to some extent more broadly in other applications. I have spent some time working kind of with global blockchain and healthcare initiatives. So that was my focus for the last couple of years, including groups like Fuse, which is the Pharma User Software Exchange that had a blockchain working group, the Government Blockchain Association, where I led healthcare efforts in the UK, so interfacing between industry and government. Overall, my kind of biotech and health tech experience is primarily in operations. So I was helping run various early stage startups, both in Canada and in the UK. For the last year and a half or so, as I said, I've been focused primarily on running Metadvice, which is an AI digital health startup. But I also consult to and advise a number of different startups in the space, both in Canada and in the UK, as well as I'm involved with some organizations like the British Standards Institute, where we're working on blockchain standards, for example, and with the WHO with their digital health strategy.
Yeah. Okay, great. I mean, it sounds like you're pretty busy then. So, I mean, you mentioned obviously Metadvice, which is where you're working now, and that's taking up the majority of your time. What is it? How does Metadvice kind of fit into the digital health sphere, and what kind of issues are you trying to solve there?
Sure. So Metadvice, broadly speaking, is building AI-enabled decision support, both for doctors, for the clinical side, and for pharma, that is really designed to enable precision medicine. So, treating the right patient at the right time for the right disease, the right kind of intervention, which can be quite difficult for complex disease, which, as I said, present differently for different patient groups. And sometimes one therapeutic doesn't work the same way for one patient subtype as it does for another. And that's often pretty difficult to dissect. Sometimes doctors have a hard time treating those patients, and what happens is a patient might get placed on a therapy. It's kind of a trial and error approach. They go away, see if the therapy works. It doesn't work. They come back, put on another therapy. Patient goes away, see if it works. Doesn't work. They come back, and there's this kind of cycle of trial and error that while those medications aren't working, or sometimes they might present with side effects for the patients, the disease is not getting better. So the patient is actually getting worse during that process. And so we're trying to eliminate that to some extent, to the extent that we can, using data and analytics, and to be able to really present doctors with recommendations to better diagnose and treat these kinds of conditions right from the beginning. So in the clinical space, we're currently focused on hematological oncology, so that's blood cancers. And this is a space where there's really a number of different available therapies that have recently come on the market, things like gene therapy, cell therapies. These are quite expensive, and they're also quite specific for who would benefit from them early on versus not. And so it's important to be able to kind of channel that information to doctors who may not be aware of the therapies as they come on the market necessarily, or not really aware of who the best patient for that therapy would be. And so you need to really analyze data and come to a kind of precision medicine decision about that patient. And we're also operating in complex disease like cardiovascular and metabolic disease, which, for example, type 2 diabetes is one, hypertension, high cholesterol disorders. And those are really disease that are global, they're prevalent, and they're very different in how patients present with them. So there really needs to be more precise, more targeted approaches that we use to diagnose and treat these patients. We've also recently started working in autoimmune disease, so namely arthritis, which is also quite a complex disease in how it presents and how patients are diagnosed and treated. And it is important, there's so many new therapeutics that are rolling out on the market. It's important to understand who would benefit from some of the novel, the more expensive treatments, and who wouldn't, or for who there might be side effects or complications, for example.
Yeah.
So that's kind of on the clinical side. And for pharma, we really use our AI engine to better enable real-world data analysis to support clinical work and to support market research activities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems like obviously it's quite a broad range. I mean, although each of those sectors are quite niche, and you're solving real world problems for patients and things like that, which is fantastic. Is it, I mean, in terms of your business model, is it a kind of the same approach regardless of the the disease or the ailment or whatever you're trying to fix? I mean, do you have the same kind of AI for that, or do you have teams separated out individually for each one?
So right now we are taking more or less a similar approach for all of our disease indications. And what we found is that we can do that. And to some extent, it enables us to kind of rapidly onboard new disease indications. So our collaborations to date have been largely driven by people we know, essentially. So those that we've worked before, whoever's in our network. So Metadvice has quite a seasoned and expert team, actually. So the idea was founded by Professor Richard Barker. He is a global expert in precision medicine and is recognized as one of the great contributors to the field. And he came together with Serge Umansky and Andre Jan, who are experts in physics and mathematics, to build this AI-enabled solution and company. And together, they have quite a wide network of people that they have worked with previously. Richard is quite well known in the pharma space as well. He was on the board of Celgene, for example, which is a large pharma company that was recently acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb. And they've got some of these clinical experts, basically, that they've worked with before. And so we've started the work with those clinical experts and are now looking to move to onboarding additional clinical experts that we can work with to better understand and better analyze these diseases. So to some extent, we can apply the same tools that we have across all indications that are, AI-based tools. But what we really do is we work quite closely with the clinical experts to understand what the problems are in the field, what are the challenges in diagnosing and treating patients, and how AI and precision medicine approaches can help unlock some of those challenges or help identify novel solutions, basically. And I think that as we go along, we'll see that our approaches might change or might shift slightly depending on the indication, but so far, largely, they've been pretty consistent.
Okay, fantastic. So, I mean, in terms of the actual delivery of these, I suppose prescriptions or medicines to solve these, are you partnering with individual businesses? I mean, you might have quite a community around you of integration with different businesses, or are you providing this yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I suppose it's something that a platform technology can do in the future. Our primary objective is to provide recommendations. So on the clinical side, again, as I mentioned, that's typically to doctors who are making those decisions. And we're not designing an autonomous AI that is actually making the diagnosis for the doctor. That's not really our goal. Really what we're doing is providing AI-driven recommendations that the doctor can understand and that they can actually learn from, see the evidence for why a technology will be making those recommendations. So some of those reasons behind those recommendations might be those are the most recent new guidelines that have come out. So for example, in the UK, NICE is the body that guides clinical decision making. So if there's a new NICE guidance, then we can channel that through our system. In some cases, that may be a new clinical trial or a new drug on the market that was supported by a recent clinical trial. And so that's why that recommendation is presented to the doctor for that specific patient group. And to some extent, and this is really kind of the more interesting and the more precision medicine approach, it is from looking at real world patient data. And so this is also what we work with our clinical experts to look at, to analyze. It's really their patient data with histories over time. How has that patient been treated over time? How has their diagnosis changed or not changed? And what can the AI learn from that, basically, such that patients in the future get treated more effectively. And so our goal is to eventually have an active learning AI that can actually use new data that gets fed in from, based on the recommendations that we give. A doctor makes a decision, prescribes a certain therapy to a patient, and then we can see, did that therapy work for that patient? Did they observe any side effects? And so on. And so that kind of approach is designed to refine the precision of those decisions over time. Because our AI right now is still quite nascent, any decisions that we would be recommending to the doctors would be mostly based on things like guidance, literature, and to some extent limited patient data. But as the AI learns more and more over time, that those decisions become better and better. So that's the goal.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like, the overall industry in general is kind of moving towards taking some of the burden away from those, clinicians and potentially like pharma businesses that are up until now, or up until recently anyway, almost solely responsible for the diagnosis and the treatment of these conditions. I mean, is that something in terms of the sort of trends that you're seeing in the digital health community and the pharma community? Is that something that you, I suppose, feel free to disagree with me, but is that something that you're seeing, and do you think overall things are starting to go that way?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The pandemic has obviously accelerated certain trends that we have been seeing over the last few years. There's definitely been an uptick in digital health adoption in tools like telemedicine, particularly, and it's something that I'm personally really glad to see. There has been an uptick in technologies such as AI and blockchain as well. And I think that that's also really welcome in the community. I think there was a fear amongst some of the community that some of these technologies will suffer a so-called winter if they weren't adopted, soon enough. But I think it's become evident now that they are really enablers of future solutions, such as ours, because clinical systems, doctors will be turning more to digital solutions that will enable them to perform their functions better, faster, and anywhere they are in the world. And what it will also accelerate, I think, is some sort of democratization of healthcare. So it will no longer be as important where the patient is and where they're necessarily seen if they can have access to a clinician via remote solutions, and if those clinicians can actually make decisions about their diagnosis and therapy. Right. So, I mean, there's to some extent, not everything is possible with telehealth, with remote, but you can certainly get access to some of the best clinicians without having to go to kind of a medical center in the heart of a city if you're based in the country. If those clinicians particularly have access to decision-making capabilities that are state-of-the-art, and AI can enable that to some extent. Something that I've also noticed personally is that I think there's this globalization of digital health that I've not really seen before. I am involved with the WHO and on a couple of different groups for technology standards and so on. And it's really been great to see that everyone's kind of trying to solve the same problems, and with somewhat similar tools. I mean, they vary across geographies, and there's different industry players in different geographies, but it's really enabling countries, specialists, to work better together, to learn from each other in a way that I don't think they've been able to do before. And I think this is partly also due to the rapid adoption of remote work and collaboration that we were talking about before. And I think that that's really welcome. So it removes certain barriers for some people who are maybe, for example, are in less affluent institutions and who aren't able to travel to the regular conferences that all the experts attend. But they are still able now to actually be part of the solution process and to be able to contribute to how we work with and adopt these technologies. And so I think we'll see those trends, and hopefully they will stick, right? So I think what we will see as the pandemic kind of quiesces is there will be an interest to understand how some of these solutions that have been working well can really become fundamental, can support new business models, and really figuring out what can be that new normal for healthcare systems. I think that it'll be important to ensure that these efforts aren't rolled back, because there's been so much effort and so much acceleration in the field.
Yeah, definitely. And like you say, I mean, this is just kind of the whole digital health industry is under a bit of a microscope at the moment, and well, no pun intended, but I think it's really surely going to revolutionize the whole industry, and I suppose that access to it's not just the access to medicine for the patients, it's also the access to the data for the clinicians and people like that as well, and breaking down those geographical barriers through technology to be able to kind of increase those data pools, right? And obviously being able to learn from each other. So I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and it's obviously some really good work you're doing, and I'm pleased to see the traction that you guys are getting. If anyone does have more questions for you or wants to find out more about Metadvice or any of the other companies that you're involved with, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. So that's Natalie Pankova, or go to our website at metadvice.com and submit an inquiry. You can also follow Metadvice on LinkedIn and Twitter, sign up for our newsletter, and you'll receive regular updates.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. It was really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be lots of conversations that will come off the back of this. So exciting to see what happens in the future. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Duncan. It was my pleasure.
So that's that then. Well, thank you very much to Natalie for taking the time to chat with me. Really interesting, again, to hear from her. And again, as always, lots more that could have been discussed. And if you do have any questions for her or anyone else that I've spoken to, I always put their contact details or a way that you can get in touch with them in the summary of this podcast. So feel free to do a bit more research on Metadvice, hit up Natalie if you've got any further questions, and keep the conversation going. So stay safe, and until next time, I'll see you then. Bye.
Spilling the Beans Digital Health Podcast is aimed at members of the digital health community globally, with guests from the United Kingdom, Australia and the United States. The podcast is available through all major podcast distributors as well as on YouTube. The show is sponsored by Woodrow Mercer Technology and Woodrow Mercer Digital Health.